You're not even a real Blackwell. Those 7 words shattered everything I thought I knew. 3 days after my grandmother's funeral, my father dropped a truth bomb that wasn't meant to protect the family. It was meant to erase me from it. But what he didn't realize was this. The blood he tried to weaponize might not even be his. You're not even a real Blackwell. The words echoed in my ears long after my father left the study, his polished shoes clicking down the hallway like a final insult. I stood there, frozen, surrounded by Grandmother Ella Laner's books, the scent of old pages and lavender still lingering like her presence hadn't quite let go. It felt like the whole house was holding its breath. Until 5 minutes ago, I believed Douglas Blackwell was my father. Not perfect, not affectionate, but mine. Now he'd tossed that belief away like it was nothing more than an inconvenient truth, just another chess move in his desperate grab for the family fortune. What are you talking about? I'd managed to ask, stunned. He hadn't even blinked. Don't play innocent, Jennifer. Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore. Once the lawyer confirms there's no Blackwell blood in you, you'll get nothing. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. The fury in his voice was barely contained, like he'd been waiting years for the chance to say those words. And I saw it then, not just greed but something darker. Resentment. Loathing. Like I'd been a stain on his perfect legacy. I remembered the way he'd always looked at my brothers, Thomas and William, with pride. And the way he looked at me, with indifference at best, irritation at worst. That never made sense. I'd graduated with honors, built a career in historic preservation, worked hard for everything I had. But it had never been enough. Too soft. Too unfocused. Not his. Still, I'd never imagined this. He told me I could attend the will reading if I wanted, if I must, but not to expect anything. He'd already spoken to Harrison Mills, his longtime friend and our family lawyer. We'll challenge any provisions that include you, he said with a shrug, like I was a clause in a contract he couldn't wait to redact. I didn't argue. I just said, I'll be there. Because I had to be. Grandmother would have wanted me there. I dropped into her desk chair, tracing my fingers along the polished walnut, remembering her handwritten letters, the way she always said, a Blackwell makes their own path. Maybe she'd known. Maybe she'd tried to warn me. The last time I saw her, she gripped my hand and whispered, trust your instincts, Jennifer. Not everything is as it appears. Back then I'd assumed it was just grief talking. Now I wasn't so sure. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. We need to talk about your father. Tonight. Alone. My throat tightened. If Douglas wasn't my biological father, then who was? And why had they kept it from me for 27 years? Only to unleash it now, just days after Grandmother's funeral. The timing was no accident. This wasn't a revelation. It was a strategy. And the game had just begun. Later that evening, I met my mother at a quiet cafe tucked away from the polished corners of Blackwell society. She looked smaller than usual, her tailored coat slightly rumpled, her eyes shadowed with something between fear and fatigue. I never wanted you to find out this way, she said the moment I sat down. Her fingers trembled as they turned her wedding ring round and round. So it's true? I asked, the words nearly catching in my throat. Douglas isn't my father? She didn't speak. Just nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Everything I had ever known about my family shifted in that moment. It's more complicated than Douglas makes it sound, she whispered. It wasn't some affair. Before I ever met him, I was in love with James. Uncle James. The rebel. The one who never stayed long, but always made me feel seen when he did. We were young, she continued, planning our future until he was offered a fellowship in Seattle. It was everything he'd worked for. We thought we could survive the distance, but it got harder. And I was lonely. That loneliness, she said, had led her to Douglas, a man who had always admired her from afar, and seized the opportunity when her relationship with James faltered. It was brief. A mistake, really. I ended it as soon as I realized my heart still belonged to James. She took a breath before delivering the next blow. When I found out I was pregnant, I was sure the baby was James's. The timing fit. But James was already engaged to someone else, and Douglas proposed. Her voice turned brittle. He said he loved me, that he wanted to build a family. But now I know it wasn't about me. It was about the Blackwell name. He needed a legitimate heir. And you said yes? I asked quietly. I was trying to protect you, she said. I thought marrying Douglas would give you stability, a name, a future. But I was wrong. I never imagined he'd one day use that name to hurt you. I sat back, the pieces falling together like a tragic puzzle. Douglas had never treated me like his daughter. Not really. And now I knew why. He'd always known I wasn't his. And he'd been biding his time, waiting for the moment he could use that truth to his advantage. What about James? I asked. Does he know? She shook her head. No. I never told him. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My childhood, my sense of identity, the icy way Douglas had always spoken to me. It all made sense now. And yet, it left me more hollow than I'd ever felt. As I stared at my reflection in the cafe window, same dark eyes as James, I now realized, one thought consumed me. If Douglas wanted to play the bloodline game, fine. Let's play. The next morning I stood outside Uncle James's apartment, a modest brick building on the quieter side of town. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had called him the night before, vaguely asking if we could talk about the will before the reading. He had agreed, curious but unsuspecting. Now, standing in his living room, surrounded by scientific journals, travel photos, and two mismatched mugs of tea, I was struggling to find the words. You seem troubled, Jennifer, James said gently, watching me over the rim of his cup. I hesitated. Then, slowly, carefully, I asked the question that had been burning on my tongue since the cafe. Uncle James, did you and my mother ever have a relationship? Before she married Douglas? His cup froze halfway to his lips. He blinked as if trying to decide whether I was joking. Then, carefully setting it down, he said, That's a very specific question. Douglas told me he's not my biological father, I explained. And he's using that to try and remove me from grandmother's will. James leaned back, his expression shifting from curiosity to something else. Pain, maybe. Or guilt. And what did your mother say? She told me the truth. That she loved you. That you were together before she married Douglas. That I might be your daughter. James didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. She never told me she was pregnant. By the time I found out she was marrying Douglas, it was already done. I figured she moved on. He stood and began pacing slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. I always felt a connection to you, but I thought it was just family. Niece to uncle. He turned back to face me, his voice softer now. Are you saying you think I might be your father? I nodded. Yes. And if that's true, then I still have a rightful claim to grandmother's estate. Maybe an even stronger one. He didn't hesitate. Then we need to know for sure. We arranged for expedited DNA testing that same afternoon. A private lab. Discreet. Results in 72 hours, just enough time before the will reading. Submitting the samples felt surreal. Scientific yet intimate. As I handed over the envelope with my name on it, the technician smiled and said, We'll be in touch soon. I nodded, but my mind was already elsewhere. What would it mean to have proof? Would James want to be part of my life? Would Douglas accept it? Unlikely. And most of all, would it help me protect the final wishes of the only person in this family who had ever loved me without conditions? Later that night, I called grandmother's personal attorney, Bernard Walsh. He wasn't part of the inner family circle like Harrison Mills. He was sharp, discreet, and fiercely loyal to my grandmother. I can't reveal the details of the will, Bernard said kindly over the phone. But I can tell you this, your grandmother was not blind. She knew who you were, Jennifer. And I believe she left something that reflects that knowledge. It wasn't a confirmation, but it was enough. I was done feeling like a ghost in my own family. And for the first time in my life, I had proof that the blood running through my veins carried the very name they were trying to erase. 2 days before the will reading, the DNA results arrived in my inbox. I stared at the subject line for a full minute. Confidential DNA test results. Jennifer Blackwell / James Blackwell. My hands trembled as I clicked. There it was, in crisp clinical language. Probability of paternity. 99.99998%. James Blackwell wasn't just my uncle. He was my father. I sank into my chair, breath shallow. So much emotion swirled inside me: vindication, grief, relief, even rage. 27 years of questioning my worth, of feeling like an outsider, of quietly shrinking myself to win a man's approval. None of it had ever been necessary. Because I wasn't his daughter to begin with. And now I finally had proof. I called James immediately. He answered on the first ring. "I suspected," he said softly after I told him. "I felt it for years. Your mother's smile, my eyes. But this changes everything." We agreed to meet before the will reading, to discuss our strategy. We were now armed with the truth. But truth alone wouldn't protect us from the web Douglas had already begun spinning. That evening I received an unexpected message. Harrison Mills, Douglas's lawyer and longtime ally, requested a private meeting. I knew better than to go in blind. I brought a copy of the DNA results with me. His office, as always, was all mahogany wood and ivory inlays, a quiet performance of wealth and control. Harrison, calm and condescending, welcomed me with a handshake that didn't linger. "Jennifer," he began, sliding a document across the table. "Let's avoid a messy dispute. Douglas is prepared to offer you a one-time settlement of $250,000. In return, you'll waive all rights to the Blackwell estate." I didn't even look at the number. "You're joking." "Not at all," he replied smoothly. "You're not his biological daughter. That complicates things." I slid the DNA results across the table without saying a word. Harrison scanned the document, his jaw tightening slightly, but only for a second. "James," he murmured. "Interesting." "More than interesting," I said. "It makes me Eleanor Blackwell's only biological grandchild." There was a pause. Harrison's face didn't betray much, but his next words told me everything. "There are complexities in the trust," he said slowly. "Clauses that favor legitimate lines of descent." "You mean bloodlines," I corrected. "Which I now have. And Douglas does not." His eyes flicked up, surprised. "What?" I smiled. "Did you really think I came here without learning everything?" He didn't respond. But I had his attention now. Because I hadn't just proven my place in the family. I had just exposed the one secret Douglas had buried deeper than mine. He wasn't a blood Blackwell either. The next morning my phone rang before sunrise. James's name lit up the screen. His voice was tight with urgency. "Jennifer, I just got off the phone with someone who used to work at grandfather's clinic decades ago. A nurse. She told me something. Something that changes everything." I sat up in bed. "What is it?" He hesitated before dropping the bombshell. "Douglas isn't a biological Blackwell." For a moment I didn't say anything. My brain couldn't quite process the weight of those words. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "Apparently, my parents adopted Douglas as an infant after several miscarriages. They kept it secret. Even I didn't know. But this nurse, she was there. She saw the documents. She says Eleanor might have known all along." I stared out my window as the autumn light broke through. If this was true, Douglas's entire argument, that I didn't belong because I wasn't Blackwell blood, was about to collapse in on itself. "What are we going to do with this information?" I asked quietly. James didn't answer right away. Then he said, "That depends. Do you want justice, or do you want peace?" "I want Douglas held to his own standard," I replied. "He weaponized biology. Let's see how he likes being on the other end of it." We spent the rest of the day preparing. James obtained records that supported the nurse's story, including an archived hospital file confirming the adoption. I had my DNA results, and Bernard, grandmother's private attorney, was expected to make a surprise appearance at the will reading. He'd recovered from his sudden illness and promised to bring a letter that Eleanor herself had left behind. We didn't know its contents, only that she'd requested it be read if any questions of bloodline arose. By the night before the reading, I felt strangely calm. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I was simply standing in the truth. The morning of the will reading, James and I arrived together. The family mansion was filled with familiar faces. My brothers, aunts, cousins, all gathered like wolves waiting to feast. Douglas sat at the head of the table, confident, smug. He glanced at me as if this were already won. But this time I had more than my voice. I had evidence. And soon, he'd realize the story he tried to bury had claws. The room quieted as Harrison Mills, our family's longtime attorney, opened his leather-bound portfolio. His voice carried the controlled confidence of someone used to managing high-stakes legal drama. "Before we proceed with the reading of Eleanor Blackwell's final will and testament," he began, "we must address a matter regarding beneficiary eligibility per the Blackwell Trust, which, as you all know, requires direct biological descent for inheritance." Douglas sat tall, chin lifted as if awaiting a standing ovation. He cleared his throat and pushed forward a sealed folder. "I have DNA evidence proving that Jennifer is not my biological daughter. Therefore, she is not entitled to any part of the Blackwell estate governed by the trust." Murmurs filled the room. My brothers looked uneasy, my mother visibly tense. But I stayed still. Harrison examined the folder, flipping through the results. "These tests seem valid, though the source of the DNA isn't documented." I met Douglas's eyes and asked, "And how did you get my DNA exactly?" He smiled coldly. "From your water glass at our last family dinner. It was efficient." "That's not just unethical," James interjected, standing. "It's illegal. That test was taken without her consent." "Irrelevant," Harrison said, setting down the folder. "The trust cares only about bloodline." "Then you'll want to see this," I said calmly. From my bag, I pulled out a second folder, our DNA test, legally done, professionally documented. I stood and handed it to Bernard Walsh, who had just entered the room, cane in hand, expression unreadable. He reviewed it in silence. "This test confirms that James Blackwell is Jennifer's biological father," he said aloud. The room fell into stunned silence. Douglas's composure cracked. "That changes nothing," he barked. "She was still raised under false pretenses. She was never meant to inherit." James stood again, taller now in truth than I'd ever seen him. "You want to talk about pretenses?" he said. "Let's talk about yours." He placed a third folder on the table, opening it slowly. "These are adoption records. Douglas Blackwell was adopted. Our parents took him in after a series of miscarriages. He was never told. But Eleanor knew." Gasps. A cough. Someone dropped a teacup. James continued, voice unwavering. "According to the original trust document, beneficiaries must be direct descendants of Harold Blackwell. Douglas, by his own argument, does not qualify." I looked at Douglas. His face had gone bone white. "You promised only blood relatives deserved the inheritance," I reminded him. "Are you going to keep your word?" For once he had nothing to say. Just then Bernard cleared his throat. "There's more," he said. "Eleanor anticipated this exact situation. She left behind a letter, to be read if questions of lineage arose." He unfolded a sheet of cream stationery stamped with the Blackwell crest and began to read. And as the words echoed through the room, everything shifted. Bernard's voice, though quiet, cut through the tension like a scalpel. "To my family gathered here," he read from Eleanor Blackwell's letter. "If this letter is being read, then long-buried truths have surfaced, and difficult decisions must now be faced." I saw Douglas flinch. Beside him, my mother's hand tightened around mine beneath the table. "I have always known that Douglas was not born of my blood," Bernard continued. "He was brought into this family through love, after years of loss. We never intended to treat him differently. But the truth is, his lineage is not of the Blackwell bloodline required by the trust established by my father." The room fell into stunned silence. "On the other hand," Bernard read, eyes flicking to me, "I have known for years that Jennifer is James's daughter. I recognized my blood in her from the moment I first held her. Her curiosity, her conviction, her kindness, they are of our legacy." Douglas's mouth opened, but no sound came. He looked like a man watching a life's work crumble in real time. "In accordance with the trust," Bernard continued, "the assets requiring Blackwell bloodline shall pass to my son James and to his biological daughter Jennifer." I didn't move. I didn't need to. The weight of Eleanor's words did all the heavy lifting. "The remainder of my personal estate," Bernard concluded, "I have distributed separately and thoughtfully. I leave Douglas a modest inheritance, a gesture of gratitude for the years he spent as my son. But his actions, particularly toward Jennifer, have revealed a character I cannot reward with more." At that, Douglas lunged forward, his voice finally returning, twisted in rage. "You promised. You said I'd inherit everything. No, I replied, standing slowly. You said that. And you promised that only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell fortune. James rose too, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. And by your own logic, Douglas, you've disqualified yourself. There was nothing left to say. Harrison Mills closed the files in silence. He wouldn't be fighting this. Not anymore. Bernard's presence, and Eleanor's meticulously written letter, had demolished any strategy he'd hoped to execute. Douglas stormed out, his sons trailing behind him in confusion and disbelief. For years he had fed them a fiction. Now the truth had devoured it. As the rest of the family dispersed in murmurs and wide-eyed astonishment, I remained seated in grandmother's study. The portraits, the books, the heavy velvet curtains, all bore witness to a truth that had finally come to light. Justice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. It was precise. I hadn't needed revenge. I hadn't needed to destroy him. All I had to do was let the truth speak. And it did louder than any lie ever could.